Hello, this is Gary Geraths, and this is one of a series of lessons on how to build up your figure drawings with solid anatomical form and line. So our subject here is a very athletic woman's torso, shoulders, and arms. I will be speeding up the video for a very quick build-up of the structure and simple forms I've dealt with in previous videos. As you might notice, I am organizing all the bigger volumes with simple blocks to gauge the overall proportions and gesture of the figure. What's most important in this process right now is making sure that all the overlaps are there, all the forms are right in the right proportion. Now I'm kind of adding in the anatomical stuff like the scapulas, there's a rib cage, the torso. Not a lot of information in the arms because I don't want those lines in there to interfere with the basic gesture of the form. One important part that I am adding to this is those red axis lines across the form, vertically and horizontally. So I may not put those in a lot of my drawings, those are always there in my head to make sure that everything is symmetrical and keeps together, and to make sure that those proportions are correct. So what I am doing right now is I'm adding the scapula, those bony triangular portions on the back of the torso. And as the arms go up, they swing to the side more. And that big long line I'm working on right now is called the arm of the scapula. It goes up and touches into the clavicle that's in the front that I'm beginning to lay in just a little bit. Now it's going to be a little bit hard just for the diagramical part of it. You can see it come up in the little inset. One of the most important parts in here is that as I go over the top of it, yes, perhaps it pops out a little too much. It's important to know where that is because as you start to gauge drawing your line quality and your shadow, it's going to show you where things are being pushed up and pulled and twisted, and it'll give a much more dynamic look to your drawing if you can come in there and articulate those gestural differences. What to focus on is when you're going through this process is that by learning where those anatomical forms are, you can really get in there and learn where to chop and to exaggerate and use more of a creative process when you draw in a workshop or just by yourself. You can also imagine here where the clavicles in the front come back and reach into those arms of the scapula on the back, and how even I'm sort of readjusting and reimagining those little arms sticking up. And here's where the muscles stick on top as well, so you can see the effect of the form of the deltoid as it bulges up on the right hand side and sort of flattens a little bit more on the left hand side. So those lines I'm building up on top of the scapula, the arms there, so what that's eventually going to do is that's going to show a sharper bend between the planes, so the lines and the forms and the values are going to be a lot more angular in their approach. Right now in the drawing, the design's coming together, so if you see me moving around the figure a lot and hitting just little teeny tiny points here and there, that's again to make sure that the general blocking out, like I said, the overall design, all the pieces work together as a cohesive unit. Why this is important is that even though I'll be going into more detail, more form, more muscles, more anatomy in here, is that basic overall design has to work before I can start to get in all the smaller fun stuff. Okay, so now we brought our reference more model back into it, so you can check that soft tissue and where the shadows are, where the line is, and you can see again how I'm kind of pulling together the entire figure drawing rather than let it break into pieces. Even though for demonstrational portions of the film that there will be some like little details that I'll be getting rid of later. So moving forward, what I'm doing now is I'm going to start to block in the trapezius muscle and latissimus dorsi, those muscles on the back, sort of bat wings on the bottom part of it that I'm kind of laying in, and then that kite shape that's on the upper part of the back. Now those are important because you can see when she lifts her arm, there's a real stretch going on, and that will be relayed with like a thinner, longer line that'll reach up into her shoulders, and then at her shoulders it'll start to bulge up more when the arms start to come together. Since the arms are coming up and scissoring in a sense together, that form has to bunch up instead of pulling like the lower parts of the lats are. Here's where we move from design to building actual form, anatomical volumes on the inside of what we put together already. Now we're ultimately going for anatomical form for the finish of this. We have something that really is solid and holds the eye. And one of my organizing principles is using this pill bottle to show you the directions the form go in, because I don't want the drawing to be flat. I want it to have volume and space and overlaps and spatial dynamics to it. Perhaps you can see the ellipses on those bottles as I push them really shows the direction that the form's going in. And that's what I'm doing right now, is I'm reinforcing that with those ellipses and those overlaps, because when I put the muscles on top of it, I want to make sure that they correspond with the volumes and the perspective, rather than just putting a bunch of flat muscle diagrams on it. So I've done several other videos dealing with this subject, and I would ask you to refer back to them to really show the idea of how these ellipses, these simple forms, can help guide a much more complex, sophisticated drawing that we're doing right now, we're starting to do right now. Looking at the inset diagrams that I provide can sometimes be a little bit intimidating, where you see all of these bumps and forms and strands and muscles going all over the place. And that's, again, the idea why you keep this simple at first, so you understand how it fits into the whole design, rather than getting caught up in the minutia and the diagram. I think another important aspect of these videos is the fact that this is not a step-by-step process. Even though I have to, in a sense, put it together this way, when you go to workshops or you're drawing it on your own, is you're going to be moving back and forth between all these different techniques and all these methodologies and ideas, and putting together a really cohesive drawing on your own. As we move back from the diagram, the inset diagram, to the actual reference, you'll be able to see that I'm just gesturing in the bigger muscle forms. Again, not outlining them, so to speak, but actually seeing the way that they work with each other in concert. That to make sure that, again, as I go through this farther and farther, remember, it's not about copying, is that you're interpreting this. And when we bring our reference back in, is that now all of a sudden you can see more of that core shadow that I'm working with. That's the difference between the lights and the darks on the back. Sometimes I'll underplay it. Sometimes I'll exaggerate it. Sometimes I'll leave it out completely, just to make sure that the whole design, the whole drawing is dynamic, rather than trying to copy things that maybe perhaps the independent viewer won't understand what's happening. Like, if you can see some of those shadows in her back, that I may want to put those down, but that would obscure the bigger overall drawing and effect of the dynamic anatomy. You also may notice an interplay in between the lines on the outside and the lines on the inside. I really haven't committed to the outside yet, because I know how important it is. At the same time, I'm not drawing any really super dark lines across the form that will cut, say, the arms off from the back or the upper arms from the lower arm. I'm making sure that the whole design holds together as one cohesive unit, so the eye flows through it naturally. I've been moving over to the left arm, and you can see how simple I'm keeping it, as I don't want to overwhelm it with a lot of anatomical details and a lot of, just little tiny pieces that will obscure the eye and get it confused. Is that paramount, that idea, that simplicity, so the viewer can see what the model is made up. And right at this point, you can see I'm starting to add a little bit more curvature to some areas. To give you another example on how to do it, I put into the inset one of Michael Hampton's diagrams from his book, and you can see it's a lot more stretch and pull, and the muscles are sort of built out a little bit more. Again, a little bit more diagramical, but it really, really works in explaining how dynamic those forms can be, and how, again, you can get different kind of methods and different sort of outlooks on a process. A good example of how we use very similar sort of ideas is the idea of, you see the way we've tapped the deltoid in, which is that muscle right on top of the shoulder, in with the scapula, which is that bony part, and then pulling our lines down to make it stretch more. Just like you're pulling a rubber band and it stretches, the lines get thinner and the core shadows even get thinner. Now I'm ready to go up in the shoulders and blast away at that trapezius muscle, which is in the inset. It's that kite-shaped muscle that fits into the neck, out into the shoulders, and way down into the back. The right arm is really pushing up, and as it pushes up, it pushes that deltoid farther into the neck. So you can see those little tiny marks I'm making right now, those little bulges. You also might notice I put most of the darker line underneath where the shadow is, and where the curves are, you can see the core shadow that's sort of little bit separated away from the main form lines. Look closely as I build up the top of the shoulder down, this deltoid, which is that muscle to the right of where the trapezius muscle is. And remember that little, you can see that remnant, that blue remnant of the scapula and the clavicle coming in. You can see how it pushes up, and as it pushes up, almost like a wave, it gets pile drived up over the top of that bone and tendon, and it piles up and makes more of a rounder form that pushes into the trapezius muscle. As I mentioned before, you have to take that diagram, which is basically a flat thing on the left-hand side, and move it and change it to work for your better design. And so what I'm doing is I'm changing them into like little hoses that I'm pushing and shoving around with their back. And on the right hand side, you can see I'm accenting again that core shadow, which is pushing up a little bit more on it. I'll probably come over with it and soften it later, but this gives me really good demarcation between where the top planes are and where the side planes are. So at this point in the demonstration, I'm just going to give it a rest for a few seconds and then just draw. And just make sure you pay attention to the visual flow as my lines move over the top of the figure. So I went in there and edited out, erased out the upper planes for the light logic on it. So I want to make sure that as I go back into these next steps, the idea of the light coming from above the figure is paramount. Still moving back and forth between the interior and the exterior. Now that line on the inside is too dark, so now what I'm going to do is come and reassess and reform the outer line so it doesn't compete, then soften that one on the inside a little bit more. As we move through this, it's really easy to get stuck on all those little shadows and all those lights and darks and all that pieces of detail and information. But once again, make sure you move that pencil around up and down, across the elbows, up into the hand, into the back, so your design is cohesive and solid and all the pieces talk to each other. Getting pretty confident on where everything is and what I'm doing with it. So at this point, what I'm doing is editing, moving some line, adding a little bit more volume to that shoulder, pumping it up a little bit more, going cross contour, seeing where the outside contour talks to the inside contour, so it doesn't end up looking like a coloring book that your eye goes to the inside and then goes to the outside of your design, making sure that again the elements don't become isolated. You may not want the viewer to see just one section of it. It may be, again, the whole flow of the drawing, the narrative of it. Almost like you're telling a story with your drawing. You want the viewer to move through different portions of it. Like right now I'm adding the trapezius muscle, and that goes up into the shoulder, and that goes up into the arm, and then through the upper arm all the way to the hand that I'll get to later. Perhaps now the time for a little less talking and a lot more drawing here. So now we're about to move into the hands. And I'm using again one of Michael Hampton's little inset diagrams here. Even though it may not be in the right direction, as you can still see that the general overall structure and methodology is the same as I'm using as his. It's very sound. You really make sure that you can see the angular parts of the upper part of the fingers as opposed to the more soft, pliable, rounded muscular areas below the fingers. This is also the point where perhaps the book learning adjusts to real life. So you can see in the diagram, those fingers are pretty stubby. It's the structure of it. It's the diagram of the of how to put the thing together. So you can see it's very squared off, whereas our model has very, very thin feminine fingers. And so what I'm doing in here is I'm taking his information and adjusting it to the photograph and to the model. At this point, we're about to pull back and look at our reference and our drawing at the same time. I'm going to be putting the sort of finishing touches on it, the idea of like sort of bringing it up and bringing your eye to perhaps certain places in the drawing. And you'll be able to see that again, I soften some areas up. I accent other areas to bring the whole design, the whole drawing together, and show the light logic and the tension and passive areas of the sketch. So as I bring this one drawing to a conclusion, you'll see I'll have two different versions. This is the film version, this more natural version. There'll be a scanned version where I brought the contrast up so you'll be able to see more of the breaks in the bigger planes and the breaks in the bigger forms. It's a little bit more jarring, but perhaps you'll be able to see the line quality a little bit better. Now at this point, what I'm doing is that I'm going to moving on to a drawing with less diagramical stuff. This is more as I would draw it if I was in a workshop. This model obviously is not as athletic or articulated as the other model. So you're going to see that the lines and some of the forms, even though the pose is similar, will be completely different in that there will be very little structure in here, or let's say less structure in here. You can still see the form for the rib cage, and the skeletal gesture is still in there. But it's not as overwhelming as they say the first part of the demonstration. This is very similar to the way that I'd work in a workshop. So those landmarks and all the rest of the pieces are going in. I am using the techniques and methods that I showed you in the last part of the demonstration, but at the same time, I'm sort of really super simplifying it because now time is of the essence, right? This is about a sped up, 10-minute long drawing. I wouldn't have the luxury of looking at a photograph, even though that's okay for this demonstration, and in general it's fine to learn from. But if this is 10 minutes and I have a model in front of me, what I'm going to start doing is hitting the very pertinent, the most important parts of the drawing, so either I can go back and articulate it later, or I can build on top of my design. Since I have such a relative short amount of time, I'm accenting the inside corners, basically where the top of the light forms out and where it hits the side of the figure. So you see the breaks between the form shadows and where the gesture of the arms are going up and around the corner. Okay, now as I move into completion, less talking, more drawing. Now I'm plowing along, getting everything all set up, really active lines, moving back and forth, and then, yes, the film speeded up a little bit, I think it's about 50%, but it still gives you a pretty good idea of the integration between process, anatomy, and gesture drawing. Now as I move into the last 8 or 9 minutes of a 10-minute long sketch, I'm going to soften up some areas, not make some of those shadows a little bit too hard, come in maybe accent the upper planes where the light is, accent the gesture of the arms going upwards. In general, I'm trying to pull the whole drawing together. So I'm softening up some areas, bringing accents and attention to other, going back into the back of the head and giving them a little bit more form to counterbalances those big open sweeps of her shoulder and her back. At the end here at 10 minutes, what I'm doing is just reasserting those like real important lines, and now it holds together as an entire singular drawing. So thanks once again for viewing the video, and there's other ones you should take a look at if you have a chance. And I'm going to wind this up with a few of my own drawings from workshops so you can take a look at the techniques sort of used in the wild, so to speak. I really appreciate you taking a look at it. If you have a chance, leave a little thumbs up there, or even if you liked it even more, leave a nice comment so I can kind of learn from off of this. Thank you very much. Bye.